Hello and welcome to all who are listening to this podcast. This is the first podcast I've ever done, so thank you for being here. This is for a school project for part 2 of my Capstone project in reflective practices in the teaching of reading. I got to sit down with Dr. Melanie Reeves to record a podcast, and the podcast focused on culturally relevant, responsive, sustaining, and revitalizing literacy instruction. Dr. Reeves is somebody I go to when I have questions about all sorts of things, but especially all things literacy. So thank you to Dr. Melanie Reeves for sitting down with me, and I hope that all who are listening enjoy. What is your take? What do you think? How would you describe culturally sustaining pedagogy?
Yeah, so I think of just those terms, culture, sustaining, and pedagogy, like what all of them mean, so then what they mean together. So pedagogy just means teaching strategies.
Okay.
It's like how you teach, and it's like a big fancy word, but it really is just a collection of, your pedagogy, like your pedagogy, is a collection of practices that you use as a teacher in order to teach. And then, of course, culture, we can have a big conversation about the definition of culture. But basically, it's our ways of being in the world and our values and the things that matter to us and how we attach those to our identities, basically. And it has to do with many things. It can be physical, but it could also be, ethnicities. It could be sense of place of where we're from. Like all those things can come together. And then when I think of the word sustaining, I think of truly valuing something to make it with the intent of making it to keep going. Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah, that's nice.
So we often use the word sustaining in the realm of like sustaining environmental practices, right? Like how can we sustain our environment in ways that it'll be here for future generations, right?
Yeah.
Well, in order to have sustaining practices, it has to start with a value, okay? So like if I value the ocean, as part of my environment, then I'm going to engage in some sustaining practices that keep the ocean clean and here. So then when I think about what do all three of these words mean when you put them together for our work? Culture and identity is really important, and it is something I've been thinking more about lately, that I feel like culturally sustaining pedagogy is often missing a big piece of just identity in general. And because there are aspects of who we are and how we identify that we may connect with a culture, but not as society sees a culture. So, for example, identifying with the LGBTQ plus community, right? I may understand aspects of that culture, but the broader society doesn't truly understand a lot of times cultures that are around that. Plus, just like there's no single, like, let's say Native American culture, right? There's many different cultures. Same in that identity grouping, right? There's not a single, like, this is the culture, but there are common aspects. So I just think that when it comes to culture, we need to think broadly and not only be thinking about ethnicities, right? Yeah. Like, Hispanic or Latina or Latino or Latinx or Latine, as people have been wrestling with even how you label a culture, right? And sustaining then for us is thinking about sustaining pedagogies. Yeah. So teaching practices that actually keep people's cultures moving forward in a positive way through valuing them, right? Yeah. So I think it's important that we are constantly thinking about how our everyday practices as a teacher might be perceived by students as devaluing a culture. And there was something I was going to say about, see, I started rambling. Okay, that comes. So, thinking about then what are examples of sustaining pedagogy? It should be just an everyday practice that we're constantly looking for ways to value culture. Mm-hmm. So we may want to value the cultures of the students that are in our classroom for sure, right?
Yeah.
But we also want to value cultures that our students are not familiar with, mm-hmm. because that builds their cultural competence out in the world, right? So I think I'm always looking for practices that do both those things in the classroom.
Yeah.
Does that help with that?
Oh, that's really nice, because I think that pedagogy, that word was like really, when I started like in the education program, it's like everybody's like pedagogy. I'm like, hold on, like what does this even mean?
Yeah.
You know, I'm not really that proactive of a person to just look it up, you know? So I'm just like...
Well, I don't know that it would probably be super... I mean, of course it's beneficial, but I think that sometimes you look up a definition and you still kind of go like, well, okay, but what does it actually mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then putting the words culturally sustaining is like, I think, and I don't think I'm alone in this, but I think it's like when you say like culturally sustaining, it is a little bit like alarming, because you're like, well, I don't know a lot about this.
Yeah.
And so the whole, you know, sentence feels a little bit scary.
Yes.
And it shouldn't feel scary.
Well, but it feels big.
Right.
And I get that.
Yeah.
Because when you're talking about an everyday integration into your practices, right? That is big.
Right.
That's like, I need to be aware of this, like continually and always thinking about it.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I'm drawn to the idea of it being more about a disposition as a professional. Like, I am a person who sustains cultures.
Right.
Right? Which is different than I'm a person who does things to sustain cultures.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because I can go, okay, once a month or once a year I'm going to do this big unit on many cultures, right?
Yeah.
And and I can do those things in my teaching practice, but that's very different than being somebody every day in my classroom who is constantly sustaining my students' cultures and the cultures of people that I'm learning about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I do think, did you have more on that?
No, go ahead.
I do think 2 and 4 are pretty connected. My second question was, what can educators do to move toward culturally sustaining pedagogy? And then the fourth question I had was, what does it look like in a classroom?
Yeah.
And I do want to tweak that second one a little bit. Mm-hmm. Being from Montana, and I think most schools here, almost probably, I don't know for sure, but are predominantly white. Yeah. And so what do those look like?
Well, first I am going to challenge that assumption a little bit.
Yeah, you probably should.
Because, and not, I mean, I think it's a common assumption, right?
Yep.
And I've had students who they're doing an assignment and they write about their experiences in local schools, and they'll say, well, they're just not that diverse. And I guess my initial question is always like, what level is a lot of diversity? Like, right? So, for instance, I've had students say, well, there was only one student that I could see that was Native American in the classroom, so it didn't have any diversity, right? So let's problematize that a little bit, right? Because, if you didn't get to know the 25 students in that room, there may have been other students who identify as Native American who you didn't know, right? And also, how many does it take in order to be noticed? I mean, one of the big complaints, when you fill out a form and they ask you your ethnicity, and there's a complaint for a long time that a lot of ethnicities are put into the other category. Mm-hmm. Like there's this, and then there's other. And you're like, well, I'm an other, right? Like the very definition of marginalizing somebody is othering them, right? So that's why I want to think about the fact that here in Billings, especially, we're the largest school district in the state of Montana, and we thus have the largest amount of Native American students together in one district, right? Now, there might be other places that are very close to a reservation or on a reservation that the percentage at that school is larger than what we have in Billings. However, I think my point being that I think if we get away from this idea of how much diversity is there to just saying there is diversity there, right? Because in addition to in here in Montana where we focus on, our 12 recognized tribes, but also multiple bands within those tribes that have some different cultural ways of being. We have a large Hispanic population here. That's really interesting. Yeah. Okay. So let's just think about question number 2 that you asked. What can educators do to move toward culturally sustaining pedagogy? So I would sum this up as the biggest thing we can do is learn, right? So we can, first of all, definitely learn about our students that are in our classroom. As elementary educators, we have the basically same students in our room all day long, all year long. Now, as like a middle school teacher, it's a little more challenging, right? Because you're often teaching a couple subjects and you have sections of students coming through sort of like what happens at the high school level. Mm-hmm. So those practices of how do we get to know our students and their cultures might look different at different levels. But I think there are lots of strategies out there to figure that out. So one thing I thought about is first learning about our students and their cultures. Learning about cultures that are different than our own is really important. And I guess I would add in there, like, learning your own cultural, like, sometimes I think, for those of us who are from a dominant culture, we often don't even think in terms of, like, what are our own cultural ways of being in the world, right? And I think it is important for us to understand that in order then to understand cultures that are different than our own, right? Yeah. And then I think it's important to just share what we learn in a continual fashion, right? So we share with our students what we're learning. For me right now, like I think I mentioned in class the other day, I am trying to learn more about the local land that we're on here and how Native Americans have used it in the past and present, and so that I can start incorporating a more knowledgeable land acknowledgement as a pedagogical practice, right, in my own teaching. It takes time to learn things. I won't know it all, but I can start implementing as I learn, right, as I go. So I think that's a really key piece. Oh, and I know what we were talking about. I'm going to backtrack a little bit. Okay. So the idea of understanding diversity is present in a classroom, regardless of what the students look like, because every student brings with them the things that are important to them, that they value, that come from their cultural ways of being. And if we understand cultural diversity in those terms, I think we would then question this idea that how much diversity is there, or there's a little diversity, or there's no diversity, or there's a lot of diversity, right?
Yeah.
I think kind of flipping that assumption as to there is diversity here, and we can work to find out what it is.
I think that is interesting because I think I was in college before like I even thought about my culture at all as being like a culture, you know? Instead of looking outside to what like other people's cultures might be. So, and I think that's probably where I'm still learning too, where my like question is coming from and how I would rewrite that in the future. You know?
Yeah. I think specifically about you being raised on a farm ranch type situation, right? There are particular values and ways of being in the world that kind of come from that aspect of culture. Now, not all ranchers and farmers have the exact same values and culture, right? Like, but there are some commonalities that would kind of bind you together and into that group. But there's also probably some differences, just like there is in any cultural group, right? Along those lines. So, yeah, thinking about those values, where do they come from? And then so often, the big question is as we grow up and grow in who we are, in our own personal identities, we often start bringing questions into those values and how they're enacted, which that's why culture is not a stagnant thing, right? Culture kind of moves and changes with the people who move and change within them.
Yeah, I think too it also like I think I like constantly put culture in my mind like in a box, you know, like I separate people from into this box and then this box, and oh, they're from this city so they probably think like this or whatever, and so like I'm constantly having to try and tear those boxes down all the time, you know.
And I think there's a psychological and physiological reason why you do that. As humans, part of our meaning making in the world is recognizing patterns. So we tend to group things and label them because it helps us. I mean, if you think about trying to understand our world without any categorizations, you know, it would be very difficult. But being aware that we do it, right, and that there might be some harmful, like, repercussions to that is, I think, part of a culturally sustaining pedagogy, right? Recognizing that that I have an active role in this, especially as a teacher, with many students that I work with. So, yeah, I think that makes sense.
I, just a note, I was playing, you know, the game Guess Who?
Yeah, with the pictures and
Well, the newer version it's included a lot more diversity. It's really cool.
Oh, okay.
And so it's a game that I bought for the church, and so I was playing it with a kid the other day, and you know, I said something like, "Is this person white?" Or maybe I said, "Is this person black?" And they were like, "You cannot say that." Why can't I? What do you mean? Like, why can't I say that?
Yeah.
You can't say, you know, are they black? No, like, they are black.
Yeah.
You know, like it's not a bad thing. It's just it is who they are, you know?
Yeah.
And that's like part of the stigma a little bit is that you can't say, you know, like, or anyway. I found that interesting.
Right, and I think you've touched upon a thing that I find with all of you who are, you know, pre-service teachers and teachers in training, and the enormity of this thing, as you mentioned earlier, of like, oh, this just seems like such a big thing. But I think part of it is this, am I going to say the wrong thing? Am I going to, you know, bring something in that I shouldn't say, right?
Yeah.
And the reality is the answer is yes.
Yeah.
That we all do and, you know, do that. So then the question is, how are you building in aspects of self-reflection to recognize when you do something that maybe was not culturally sensitive, or, you know, I mean, like for me in the last few years, and I've shared it with the classes I teach, I'm trying to migrate away from the plural group word of guys, right? Because not all the students I teach are guys. And yet we use the male pronoun as a way to address a plural group of people, no matter what their gender identities are, right? And you really got to start questioning, where does that come from, right?
Yeah.
Now, I realize there's some people are like, well, that's just going too far. We just say guys and we don't mean anything by it. I'm like, I get that we don't mean anything by it, but are there different words I could use that I don't have to, right, genderize this group, right? Like saying, friends,
Yeah.
or y'all, if you want to use like
Sure.
a southern term, right? So there are things that I could say. So if I have a choice, right, why not take this choice that's gender neutral instead of using a gendered term?
Yeah.
Right? But because I've used it my whole life and it's just been a part of my language and cultural ways of being, it takes a long time to retrain myself on how to, say things differently. And I still, every once in a while, say it, and I go, okay, now I gotta try to, how could I say that differently? And I think, so that all comes down to that reflection piece, right? And reflection has to be intentional. You can't just think, well, I'll reflect when I have time, right? And I mean, and you've noticed, I know we've talked about this semester, because I've asked you to keep a reflection journal, right? And something that a lot of you students are doing more of, it's like you are finding the value in intentionality and being reflective, right? And I think that's what has to be there in order for your own, like, change that you want to see in yourselves in this realm.
Yeah. I really, really appreciate how you said that, like, you will say things that are wrong, or like you will be wrong, like it just is. And like, it's funny how like, people know that they are going to make mistakes. Like, that is very common. I don't think anybody thinks that they're never going to make a mistake. But when it comes to something around, like, revolving culture, and you make that mistake, it feels really, really heavy, and for good reason. But you will make mistakes, and it is important to just take those and correct yourself, or have people around you that will correct you.
Yeah.
And move on, and in turn, you be the person that if you made that mistake before, you try to correct.
Yeah.
Someone else.
And you just, hopefully, I'm always grateful when somebody points out to me, that I do something incorrect. I think I've had a few students now who identify as transgender, right? And they prefer to have the they pronoun, because not only are they transgender, but they also just kind of would rather not have a female or male, like, pronoun attached to them. And when you are in the midst of working with them and doing projects, right, it's very easily to say, oh, go check with her over there, and everything. And it takes a while then for me to realize, and sometimes I don't even notice, I didn't notice I did it. So when in those particular cases, when I met with the students and they said, I really prefer, the they, them pronoun. And then I say to them, please feel free to point out to me if I slip and I don't use that correctly. Yeah. And every time they've been very, kind and gentle about it, but just to remind me, know, and I'm like, oh, thank you so much, because it hurts. You're right. Yeah. Like, I feel immediate, like, oh man, I shouldn't have done that. I know. Yeah. And yet, like, having that open, honest ability to have that conversation, and then having those moments where I feel the weight of it, helps me then be better as I move forward to try not to, make that kind of mistake again.
Yep. Yeah.
It's like kind of learn from the mistakes and keep moving forward, but also giving yourself a little grace to learn.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. I just a last touch on it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that part of how we feel about it as people my age or younger is like that cancel culture. Like, it's such a big thing, and there could be a whole nother conversation on that. But it is, and when to say, like, oh man, that person really does deserve to be canceled. Or, like, even if it feels that way, recognizing that, like, man, they did something because they're in the public eye. But, oh man, I could have been canceled for that if I was a popular person or whatever, Anyway.
And I think the concept of cancel culture is a very complex one that we probably don't have time for in this particular conversation. But I do think that this idea of... So when I've been in conversation with individuals who are... I don't want to say they're not pro cancel culture. How would you, like, people who feel like we're all being too sensitive, right? Kind of a thing. But I always return back to, if I am somebody of the dominant culture and I have a personal story from somebody who's had an aggression or a microaggression upon them based on their identities and cultural values and ways of being in the world, I am always going to foreground, and I think this is what culturally sustaining is all about, foreground that person's story and experience and value it. And I'm much more happy to say then we probably shouldn't do this thing that caused this person this kind of pain, right? Even if it's not something that affects me personally, because that's not, like, that is an important experience and story.
Yeah.
Right? So, but it's a complicated thing.
For sure. It's for the next podcast.
There we go. Yeah. Episode 2.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, we can make this a regular thing if you want.
Well, we could, yeah. And I'll ramble on all you want me to.
Sure. I would have endless content. Okay. My next question is, what is the difference between culturally relevant pedagogy and then culturally sustaining pedagogy?
Yeah. Okay, so what I like to think about in terms of 4 terms that have kind of evolved over the last about 20 years. So scholar teacher Gloria Ladson-Billings was really the first person to talk about culturally relevant pedagogy. And since that time, she has talked about how the reality is she didn't know it at the time, but what she really meant was culturally sustaining pedagogy. And it wasn't until she started seeing how teachers were taking up what she was putting out there in very surface ways that she realized, well, like, you can be relevant by just throwing something in, right? But that doesn't actually put forth a message of value and sustaining, right?
Right.
So an example might be that, once a year our school holds a Hispanic food festival, and we all celebrate Hispanic foods. Great, right? Nothing wrong with it. It's relevant to maybe the reason we do it is we have a large student population who identify with Hispanic culture, right? And so what we're trying to be is relevant to those students. All very good. But then that day's over and we don't do anything inside the classroom on a daily basis that shows the valuing of those students' cultures. So that's where then Gloria Ladson-Billings herself, along with other scholars, started throughout the years kind of having it evolve. So the next kind of way of thinking came, well, we need to be culturally responsive. So if a student in my classroom is sharing something about their culture, then I want to respond in a really positive way, right? Yeah. Again, it's almost like it's the next deeper step, right, of getting there. But again, it was responsive and not intentionally planned curriculum, right? And remember, we're talking about pedagogies, right? So, of course, we have responsive pedagogies. We do it all the time. We're watching a child read, and when they read in a particular way, as a teacher, we respond to what we see and we help support them in that moment, right?
Yeah.
And we may not have planned that teachable moment, but we take advantage of it right then in a responsive manner. So in a way, there's nothing wrong with being relevant, right? There's nothing wrong with being responsive with regard to culture. But eventually it really led to challenging, like, let's think about this in terms of sustaining.
Yeah.
Because in order to sustain, we have to value it, and we have to be intentional about it. And then there's really a fourth term that links directly, especially with our indigenous cultures, and that's revitalizing. Because not only do we want to sustain cultures, but there are instances where cultures have been, like, tried to get rid of it, right? And at times successful. Like some of our Native American cultures, languages are gone.
Yeah.
Because we as the dominant culture, was focused on assimilating them into the dominant culture and getting rid of their culture, which included their languages. And unfortunately, we as the dominant culture were successful in some cases.
Yeah.
But so there is a strong drive right now to revitalize those aspects of indigenous cultures that have been, they're in danger of being gone, right? And so that's kind of the progression, moving from relevant to sustaining, revitalizing. Now I kind of think of it in terms of sustaining / revitalizing, right? Like if I can work to revitalize an aspect of culture that is around me, or that especially is if I've got students who identify with a culture who's experienced, erasure histories and current. I mean, it's not just in the past. We're still actively doing things that still work against, students' cultures. So that's, I don't know if that answers your question of kind of the migration from that. There's nothing wrong with being relevant, nothing wrong with being responsive, and definitely we should be sustaining or revitalizing. So if we take them together, right, as a set of practices, I mean, really it then becomes a central part of who we are as teachers and what we do.
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Don't even think I have any questions.
Okay.
I think my last question is, what is one thing that you've learned about culturally sustaining pedagogy over the years that was really eye-opening for you?
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a lot. I'm sure there's
a lot, and I know I've shared a few in the classes you've taken with me, but there's some I think that I probably haven't shared that have been really important. So I just kind of will go through some of these moments. So when I was a teacher, there was a big movement, and this person is still out there with a multi-million-dollar professional development business named Ruby Payne, and she put forth this idea of the culture of poverty. And at the time I worked in a school that was 100% free and reduced lunch, meaning that is kind of our measurement of families' socioeconomic statuses that we serve. Also at this school we had about 70% of our students identified as Hispanic. And so that's the context that I was teaching in. And our district contracted this person to come in and do a professional development with us. And I remember sitting in the session when and it wasn't this person herself there, right? It was a trainer who'd been trained by them. But they said that one of the ways that a culture of poverty is demonstrated by families and who, especially parents who are poor, is they value entertainment over education. And the reason for this given was that every family, no matter how poor, has a Nintendo system at the time, right? But they won't come to a parent-teacher conference. And I remember sitting in that training, really wrestling with this, right? Because just the week before, we'd had parent-teacher conferences where the majority of my parents came.
Yeah.
And at least 2 of my Hispanic families, the parents had cried in the parent-teacher conference because they so valued the education that their children were getting. Like, it was such a powerful element of that they felt was so important for their children. And I just went, something's off here, right? Now, based on that moment, right, I started really looking into research and things, right? And the reality is there wasn't really any research that this was based on. This was coming out of one person's perspective of people who are poor.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot written since that time. But that was a real huge, it was more of an aha moment for me as a teacher to challenge my assumptions of my families. Because although I didn't agree with that statement, there were many other statements that this person made that I went, oh yeah, that makes sense. Well, once that one statement was made that I went, wait a minute,
right.
It made me start then challenging my own biased assumptions, and I realized I'd been carrying a lot of biases towards families who are poor. So that was one aha moment.
Yeah.
Another one was when I was working with teaching kindergarten. I had a little girl whose parents were very, very young, and the father would come, but he would just kind of stay disengaged from the parent-teacher conversations. It was mostly the mother, and so we were in conversations about ways that they can work with their daughter to help support her reading. And so I, at that time, was really interested in understanding families, just what do you do after school? To find out, there's probably things you are already doing that you, even with just a little bit more intentionality, Yeah. So the mother started sharing that they often go to a local park, after school, and they play in the sandbox and everything. And so we just start and swing on the swings. And so I shared some thoughts about when you're playing in the sandbox, if you're telling a story, you could be supporting her understanding of story and narratives by doing this. And when she's on the swing, singing a song or a poem or something like that can help with her phonemic awareness and phonological awareness. And I would explain all those things. And, I was in the midst of talking and hadn't really noticed that the father, he had a hoodie on, and he had removed his hoodie and kind of sat up a little bit. And by the time I looked at his face, he had tears in his eyes. And I was like, oh my gosh, I've said something that really offended him, and because I was just going on, rambling on. And so when I saw it, I said, I am so sorry. Did I say something that, was offended you? And he said, no. He said, you're telling me that I can help my daughter read? And I was like, well, yeah, that's what we've been talking about with this or that. And he goes, I barely can read myself. So I never thought that I would have any role in helping her read. And again, it was this big aha moment for me.
Yeah.
The message that we often send to parents and families that there's only a certain set of things they do with their children that help support them, right? And I realized that I hadn't been as, like, open about valuing those kinds of interactions, right? And I thought about how many other parents didn't get that message, you know. So that was a kind of powerful moment where I realized that I can sustain families' cultures by recognizing what they already do as a strength.
Yeah.
You know, and naming it so that they feel like it's a strength too. So that was another moment. And then also I learned a lot about when I was working with a large amount of students whose families were identified as Hispanic, and in our community they were from a particular place in Mexico. So I learned much more about their culture from there. But one of the things that really started me down the road was learning from one of our assistants who was from the same culture, sharing about how children are taught from a very young age that if they're in trouble, they aren't to look at the adult. They're supposed to look down and not make eye contact. And I know myself and other colleagues had on a time said, you know, well, you need to look at me while I'm talking to you about this, right? And I realized how non-culturally sustaining I had been by responding that way, and how I could value that culture by just allowing them to look where they needed to look. Yeah. It's a simple pedagogical act, right? But it means a lot. So that was another moment. There was this mom who had moved from California to Oregon. And again, I think it was just after school, and we were chatting, and she asked me how she could help her daughter in reading. And I said, well, one of the best things you can do for your daughter is to read to her in Spanish. And again, this mom just started crying. And I was just like, oh my gosh, like, and she said, the school in California told me specifically to stop reading to her in Spanish because it was confusing her from learning English. And I immediately apologized to her for that. I mean, even though I wasn't the one that said it, but it is not what research supports. So I explained to her that we have had a lot of research with families, parents, and children who are learning English as a second language. And one thing we have found is one of the most powerful things that can happen is they continue to become literate in their first language, because then becoming literate in the second language is much better and stronger. So, you know, here at school, we're going to focus on English, right? But at home, by engaging in reading and talking and writing even in Spanish, is going to build her literacies in that language so that she is bilingual completely. It isn't just about being able to speak Spanish and speak English. Bilingual means and biliterate, right, is that they're able to actually write and read in Spanish and English, right? Yeah. And it was just a really powerful moment with that mom, realizing just the dangers that can be put forth by our education system and those of us in it when we don't understand these practices and how important they are. So that was one, and then I think I had one more. Oh, yeah, so I really learned about this stuff, and I do have I'm going to send you away with some reading material. So there's this amazing researcher out of Arizona named Luis Moll, and he did research for many years with lots of teachers and families around what he came to term funds of knowledge. So often we think that students who come from non-dominant cultures and languages have deficits, right, when they come to school. And his focus was they actually have some strengths that if we would just take the time to find out about them, we can utilize those strengths at school to help everyone grow. So just one little example is a kid whose dad was an auto mechanic, who they were, I imagine in Arizona they had a large Hispanic population. This dad was invited to come to school and share some things he knew about fixing cars.
Yeah.
And it became a whole learning experience for everybody, right? And so that's what Louise Mull and other scholars came to say. This was a fund of knowledge. You think of a fund as like a pot of money, right? Yeah. But in this case, it wasn't a pot of money. It's a pot of knowledge and skills that these people have that other people did not have, right? So that was a huge eye-opening thing to me. And after I read about that and learned about it, I started bringing in families as guests in my classroom. I'll never forget this one woman made candy, and it was her business. She sold them. And so we created a whole month-long thematic unit about candy and business, so it had like math, and it had social studies, and it had, the chemical science with as far as how the candy's made and all this stuff. And she would come in once a week and teach us something new about the business or about the candy making. Yeah. And it was just, the kids just looked forward to it every week and were super excited. And every child in that classroom was just like hugely invested. But the child whose mom this was, it makes me emotional to remember it, because that child just felt so important, right? And the mom didn't speak any English, so we would have somebody who would interpret for her, right, when she came in. And it was never viewed as a deficit. It was like, this is actually, we're learning things from this person that none of us know or understand. And so I started doing those kinds of practices in my classroom, and I realized that it's a never-ending wealth of funds, right? Like there's not enough time in the year to actually build your curriculum around these things. But with intentionality, you can really, and to me, that is the essence of sustaining, right, cultures, is by just valuing it, centering it, making it, what we do and who we are in the classroom. So that's just a few of my experiences on that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else that you'd like to add?
Oh gosh, right? Like, I teach a whole class on this basically, right?
I know, yeah.
No, I really do think that if we would just situate ourselves as learners in every situation, like, what can I learn from the people I'm around? And especially as teachers carry so much power. Although we often, in the larger narrative of politics in our world, often feel not as powerful, right? Especially currently. But the reality is, in most families' lives, teachers do carry a lot of power. And we have the power to make people feel smaller and less than and othered. And we have the power to make them feel important and valued. And I guess I would just encourage anyone who's teaching to just take that on as their disposition, as I'm going to be a person who makes people feel important and valued for who they are.
Very nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to hear from Dr. Melanie Reeves and myself. It's the end of this podcast, but who knows what kind of stuff we'll get into in the future. Again, thank you for listening, and thank you to Dr. Reeves for helping me out with my project. We'll see you next time.